Hey guys, tonight we begin with something less ancient, something more aggressive. So before your body sinks into sleep and your thoughts drift beyond the present moment, take that moment and like the video, and do not forget to subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Oh, and most importantly, let me know in the comments, where are you tuning from? And what time is it for you now? It's always so fascinating knowing these things about you guys. Now, if you are ready, let us journey back to a time shaped by salt wind, bone-deep cold, and the firelit stillness of a world far removed from ours. Tonight's story begins on the ragged edges of northern Europe, across the iron-gray waters that cradle Scandinavia, in the days when men and women shaped their lives by the rhythm of seasons, the crack of ice, and the creaking boards of ships that kissed the open sea. But this is not the tale of fearsome raiders with horns on their helmets. That part, in fact, is more myth than truth. Tonight, we explore the quieter, harsher, and far more demanding life of those who stayed behind, the Viking settlers. Farmers, wives, blacksmiths, children, all waking to long winters and uncertain summers. Their struggles were not waged in battle, but in the soft cruelty of snow-heavy mornings and the hunger that came with waiting for the next good harvest. What follows is a calm and immersive journey through daily life in the Norse world. From the turf houses warmed by fire and breath, to the forgotten fears of fjords and forests, we will walk in the frostbitten footsteps of those who came before, their joys, their burdens, and the many quiet truths behind why you, with all your modern comforts, might not survive a single day in their world. Let the cold winds blow softly through your imagination. As we step inside, the long cold morning, waking in a Viking turf house, you wake before the light does. Not because you want to, but because you have to. The air inside your house is still heavy and clings to your lungs like the cold breath of a cave. You are not alone in this room. You never are. The sound of others stirring is muted, but constant. A shifting of limbs under blankets made of fur. A low cough from someone near the fire pit. A child murmuring in their sleep. You're in a Viking turf house, a long, narrow building half buried in the earth and roofed with thick layers of sod and timber. The walls don't creak when the wind howls. They groan. The floor beneath you is packed dirt, softened by straw. The hearth at the center of the room is cold now, though faint embers glow in its heart like the eyes of something ancient. You reach for your tunic. It's stiff with frost, even indoors. Pulling it over your head is a daily act of determination. Cold fabric against warm skin. But you're used to this. Everyone is. There's no such thing as sleeping in. Not in this world. Time and light are currency. And winter days are stingy with both. You sit up slowly, careful not to disturb the low wooden beam above your head. Many have bloodied their scalps on it. In the dim light, you can make out your family, mother, siblings, maybe even an elder if you're lucky enough to have one still with you. All wrapped in pelts, still asleep or pretending to be. You don't speak. There's no need to yet. Rising, you pad quietly to the fire pit, grab the bellows, and start coaxing the fire back to life. It takes time. Your hands are red with cold by the time it flares. Smoke begins to curl up and out through the small hole in the roof, and light fills the house in uneven patches. With warmth comes motion. Slowly, the others begin to stir. The smells of morning creep in: sour ale, smoked fish, damp wool, wood smoke, and earth. You may eat yesterday's bread, if any remains, or chew on dried meat. There's no rich breakfast. No coffee, no sweetened milk. Just what keeps the hunger from tightening too much before noon. You step outside, briefly, to relieve yourself, and are greeted by a world wrapped in snow and silence. The turf roof is white. The woodpile is shrinking fast. Your boots crunch across the ice that has formed on the threshold. The air bites. But the fjord beyond your field is still. And for a moment, the world feels like it's holding its breath. Back inside, the chores begin. You split logs, fetch water from a frozen stream, tend the goats if your family is lucky enough to have one. If not, you help mend nets or sharpen tools. Work never waits, and warmth only comes from effort. The house is dark by modern standards. One small window, no glass, just a shutter to open when the wind isn't too cruel. Candles made from fish fat offer some light, but you learn to live by firelight and intuition. You know where the wall is without seeing it. You know where the low bench ends, where the floor dips. There is no luxury in this morning, but there is rhythm. There is purpose. And despite the hardship, there is a kind of quiet harmony to it all. No alarms, no screens, no traffic, just breath, fire, and a slow stretch of daylight across packed earth floors. You will not be praised for waking early. It is expected. You will not be congratulated for chopping enough wood. It is required. But if you do not, if you linger too long in the warmth of your pelts, then you may not eat tonight, and the fire may die. This is how each day begins. With cold, with quiet, with duty. And in this world, missing the morning means forfeiting the day. You return from your outdoor tasks with snow clinging to your cloak and fingers stinging from the cold, even through wool wrappings. There is no dying rack near a radiator here, only a wooden peg hammered into the beam beside the door, where steam from the hearth will slowly draw the damp from your clothes if the fire burns long enough. Someone is grinding barley with a stone quern, the rhythmic scrape of rock on rock, the only song of the morning. Another is mending a tear in a wool tunic with a bone needle and twine. These acts are not interruptions in your morning. They are your morning. In this house, even a 10-year-old child is not free from responsibility. If you can walk, you can help carry. If you can hold a blade, you can carve. If you can think clearly, you are expected to remember what must be done without being told. There is no division between inside time and outside time. It is simply life. The cold is not a special circumstance to complain about. It is the canvas on which everything else is painted. Cold sharpens your movements, governs what you wear, limits what you eat, and decides when you rise and sleep. Fire, therefore, is not just comfort. It is survival, and the one who keeps it lit, often the mother, sometimes the eldest, is as crucial as the warrior with his axe. If you are male and of age, you may be summoned today to help gather seaweed for the fields, a pungent task that strengthens the soil for spring. Or perhaps you'll be sent to barter at the nearest settlement, a half-day's journey by foot. If you're a girl, you may spend the morning beside your mother, weaving or preparing fermented fish, your fingers raw from salt and brine. The day does not pause. It rolls forward like a slow tide, and your body moves with it. By mid-morning, the sun barely begins to show, and even then, it only offers a pale gray shimmer through the sky, a soft light that bends rather than casts shadows. Your eyes, trained by so many winters, need no blazing sun to know the time. The creak of the roof and the warmth of the fire tell you enough. There is little speech, not from tiredness, but because there's nothing to explain. Your father sharpens his knife in silence. Your mother stirs the iron pot without words. Talking in the Viking home is often reserved for storytelling, for counsel, or for trading. It's not needed for every mundane task. Everyone knows what must be done. You look down at your hands as they work, hands that are calloused, though you are young, dry, and cracked, though it is only November. You wonder briefly what the summer will bring. Will the sheep survive the winter? Will the fishing improve? Will the roof hold through the thaw? For a fleeting moment, you imagine a world with soft beds, heated walls, fresh bread every day, and a warm bath. But this vision fades quickly. That world does not exist. Not yet. Not here. Instead, you return to the fire and hold your hands over its flickering tongue. This moment, this glow, is enough. You take a small bite of dried apple, if you're lucky, or maybe salted cod. You breathe in the familiar scent of smoke woven into every cloth and corner of your home. And then, without ceremony, you rise. The morning has passed, and the day's true labor has just begun. The sun is barely a pale smudge in the sky, a cold light hanging just above the mountains. And yet, your feet are already buried ankle-deep in frozen mud, boots soaked through, fingers stiff from clenching a wooden yoke that digs into your shoulders. The farm around you isn't grand or sprawling. It's humble. A few outbuildings slouch beside the turf house, roof lines sagging under the weight of moss and damp age. There is no fence strong enough to keep the wild out forever, just woven hurdles and thorny branches stacked like hope against predators. This is not a farm in the modern sense. You don't raise livestock to sell, and you don't grow crops for trade. This farm is an extension of your breath. If it fails, you fail. You eat what you plant, wear what you shear, survive on what you repair. There are no hired hands, no market aisles, no second chances. What breaks stays broken unless you fix it. And if the grain rots before spring, you'll go hungry no matter how many gods you pray to. Your chores begin with the animals. Always. The cows are restless in the byre, the low stone shelter that shares a wall with your house. Their breath is hot and heavy in the cold, rising like ghosts into the rafters. You scoop muck from beneath their hooves with a flat wooden spade, each load heavier than the last, each movement slower as your muscles protest. Feeding them comes next. Not fresh grass, of course, that vanished months ago. Instead, you lug bales of dried hay or seaweed from aloft, careful not to spill too much. Every straw counts. Every scrap might mean one more day of milk come February. The sheep bleat sharply from their pen, stamping their hooves impatiently. You offer them turnips sliced by hand, softened just enough to chew. A pig's root and grunt, their sty reeking even in the frozen air. You pause briefly, wiping your nose with a sleeve, and glance toward the thin tree line that marks the edge of your land. The forest there is both a friend and a warning. Firewood must be fetched soon, but wolves have been heard. One boy from a neighboring farm never came back from his gathering. His mother still leaves a bowl outside every new moon, whispering to the wind. By mid-morning, you're in the field. Not to plant. The earth is too hard, but to inspect what little remains. A fence needs mending. A tool lies rusted where it was dropped before the last snowfall. Your older brother is digging a shallow trench to divert water away from the food stores. You help him with numb hands, pushing stones into the path, cursing softly as ice bites your knuckles. And all this happens with barely a word exchanged. There is no, "Are you okay?" No, "Do you need a break?" No praise or thanks or applause. In the Viking world, work is not a chore. It is the spine of your being. To complain is to expose weakness. To rest too long is to tempt misfortune. By early afternoon, the sky already begins to shift. The sun, which never rose high to begin with, starts to sink, and the wind picks up from the coast. You haul 2 buckets of icy water from the stream, not just for drinking, but for soaking flax to make thread. Each step back toward the house is a negotiation with balance and strength, your arms burning, your shoulders shaking. Inside, someone has begun preparing the evening meal. Stew, likely, barley and dried root vegetables boiled in yesterday's broth. It smells earthy, faintly sour, but warm. You place the buckets by the hearth and collapse on a bench, exhaling with the weight of 1,000 small, invisible victories. A loose roof tile patched, a gate rehung, a calf's leg bandaged. You are not proud. There is no time for that. But you are relieved. The farm survived one more day. Outside, the chickens scratch for seeds. The dog stirs from its nap, watching the tree line. And somewhere beyond the fjord, a storm is forming. But that you tell yourself, is a problem for tomorrow's dawn. Now let's move at fear on the fjord, when darkness meant danger. Evening settles not with the softness of twilight, but with the heaviness of something ancient pressing in from the edges of the world. The fjord, once gleaming with shifting light, turns to liquid iron, still and unreadable. The mountains across the water grow darker by the minute, their jagged outlines slowly disappearing into a seamless gray. There are no lamplights on the other side, no watchfires, just the quiet and the possibility of eyes that see through it better than yours. You're outside still, watching the sky for longer than you should. It is a habit you haven't been able to shake, scanning the horizon after sunset, waiting. For what exactly? You don't know. Perhaps raiders, perhaps the howl of wolves, or perhaps just the silence to break. That too can be a warning in these parts. Darkness here is not empty. It's layered, thick. It comes with stories whispered low between sips of broth, tales you heard as a child while huddled under pelts, about wights who live beneath tree roots, who snatch children that stray from home, about the Draugr walking corpses jealous of the living, who bring disease into homes if doors are left unbolted, about strange ships gliding silently along the fjord, their sails blacker than pitch, their crews never speaking. And though you try to think like an adult, the stories don't leave you. They never really leave anyone. Your family doesn't light torches unless needed. Wood is precious, and light draws attention. Instead, you carry a small oil lamp, its flame struggling in the wind. You walk to the outer edges of the farm, checking the lines again, the fences, the posts, the gate that groans no matter how it's fixed. Everything looks in place, but there's a stillness that doesn't sit right. The dog barks once, then quiets. By the time you return to the house, the shadows have grown bold. They pool in corners, stretch across the doorway, seep beneath the edges of the turf roof. The fire inside flickers, casting shapes that dance just fast enough to unsettle your mind. The stew pot hisses as someone stirs it slowly. No one talks much after dark. It's not just custom, it's survival. You sit close to the hearth, letting the warmth return to your hands. But your ears are busy, attuned not to the conversation, but to the sounds just outside, the wind's rhythm, the creak of the wooden frame, the occasional rustle in the brush. Is it the chickens, or something else? Suddenly, a loud knock, not on the door, but on your memory. A story your uncle once told. He said some creatures in the old forests mimic human footsteps. He said some thieves knock softly at windows to see if someone answers. He said some ghosts knock on the inside of doors. No one at the table moves. Your father glances toward the wall but doesn't speak. He just slowly rises and places another log on the fire. You try to swallow your fear, but it sticks in your throat. Fear, you've learned, is a second skin in these lands. You wear it under your clothes. You layer it with salt, with rituals, with watchfulness. There are carved runes above the door, and iron bits hammered into the beams. Old protections from a time before the new gods came. Tonight, the wind moans again, and this time it sounds like something with breath. You clutch your blanket tighter, but your eyes remain open. For in the Viking world, sleep is never certain. Not just because of hunger or cold, but because of what may come when the lights go out. Your brother finally speaks, his voice low. The sheep are too quiet. It's a simple sentence, but one that chills the room. Quiet sheep mean one of two things. They're sleeping deeply, or they're gone. Your father grabs his axe, not saying a word. You and your brother follow with smaller blades, more out of habit than bravery. The three of you slip outside again, boots crunching softly on frost. The night is utterly black now, the fjord a void. You feel every breath of wind like a whisper in your ear. Every creak of the trees sounds too deliberate. At the pen, you count quickly. The sheep are there, all of them. staring back at you, silent. And that, somehow, is worse. The morning fog still clung to the earth like a veil, dampening the sound of boots on wet grass. You were walking slowly, careful not to slip on the muddy path that led to the narrow harbor. It was trade day, one of the few chances your small Viking settlement had to acquire the things it could and make for itself. But it wasn't a day of joy. It was a day of tension. You could feel it in your bones. There was no market square, just the shoreline, slick with seaweed and cold stones, and the few longships bobbing quietly on the tide. Some were your neighbors, others had come from far away. You didn't recognize their carved prows or the strange patterns on their sails. They were traders, yes, but they were strangers first. And in Viking culture, strangers were dangerous. Trust was a rare and costly thing. You shifted the heavy sack on your shoulder-dried fish and coiled rope your family had prepared for this moment. Maybe you could trade for iron tools, maybe cloth, maybe nothing. Because trading wasn't just about goods. It was about posturing, reading tone, managing pride. If you offended someone without knowing it, if your offer seemed too generous or too stingy, you could ruin the deal before it began. Or worse, spark a feud that could smolder for years. The traders were already gathering near the shore, laying out their items on woolen cloths and fur pelts. Your eyes scanned their wares. Carved bone needles, colored beads from the south, a pair of boots that looked sturdier than yours. You didn't see weapons on display, but you knew they were there, always tucked within reach, just in case. You waited until someone nodded at you, inviting your approach. The man had deep lines in his face and a silver ring around his beard, a small sign of wealth, or at least ambition. He gestured toward your bundle and asked, gruffly, what you brought. His accent was strange, his words clipped. You could understand, but it took effort. Carefully, you knelt and opened the sack. The dried fish had been smoked over days, tough but nutritious. The rope, made from twisted horsehair, was sturdy, handmade. He looked at it, then at you, and said nothing. Just let the silence sit. You knew not to speak first. Finally, he motioned to a set of worn metal brooches, simple, but finer than any you owned. He pointed to the fish and said one word. Enough. You could see in his eyes that he meant it both as a statement and a test. Was it enough to you? Was he offering too little? Or too much, trying to trap you in a favor you couldn't repay? You hesitated, only for a moment, then nodded. The trade was made without ceremony. A grunt, a nod, the goods exchanged hands. But you didn't leave right away. Not until you'd turned your back and walked far enough to be out of hearing range. Just in case your silent acceptance was taken the wrong way. Trading was always risky. Even when it went well, it didn't feel safe. Because you weren't just exchanging goods, you were navigating pride, power, and unspoken rules passed down through generations. A wrong look could mean insult. A wrong word could mean violence. Later, you'd show your family the brooches. They'd nod, maybe even smile. And maybe next trade day, someone else would go in your place. Or maybe not. Because as dangerous as it was, your survival depended on it. And so you'd go again. Because in the North, nothing was ever truly free, but everything had a price. The morning chill never really left the air. Even by midday, the breeze still bit at your fingers. Your breath still hung in clouds. But you didn't notice anymore. Your body was too busy, too used to it, because Viking life was never idle, especially not for settlers. The moment you rose from the smoky turf house, you became a servant to the land. There was no such thing as free time. Only tasks that were urgent, and others that were quietly waiting their turn to become urgent. First came the firewood. You needed it always. For heat, for cooking, for boiling water, for light. The chopping wasn't the hardest part. It was the hauling. The dense logs from the surrounding woods had to be carried on your shoulders, stacked carefully in the storage lean-to, dry and high. If they got wet, they were useless. And if you didn't have enough, your family could freeze. It was that simple. Then came the water. You carried it in wooden buckets with hemp handles, heavy and sloshing. The nearest stream was half a mile away, winding through the mossy lowlands. Clear enough to drink, but still cold and crawling with stones that threatened to trip you. You had to go back and forth at least 3 times a day, sometimes more. There were no wells, and snowmelt wasn't dependable. By now, your hands were already raw. Your next task depended on the season. In summer, you turned the soil with a hand plow. You didn't have beasts to pull a full-sized plow, not yet. The earth was rocky anyway, stubborn. You grew barley mostly, and a few hardy vegetables, turnips, onions, maybe cabbage if the soil was kind. Everything had to be watched, tended, fenced. The goats had a habit of nibbling the shoots when no one was looking. If it was autumn, you were storing, drying herbs, salting fish, preparing hay. Every step had to be done right. A spoiled batch meant hungry mouths later. And if winter came early like it sometimes did, it could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Then there were the animals. Goats, maybe a few sheep. If you were lucky, a cow. You fed them, milked them, cleaned up after them. Their waste went into the compost heap that fertilized your fields. Their wool was spun into yarn by hand, using a drop spindle carved from bone. It was slow work, painful on the fingers, but it was how you made clothes, bedding, and trade goods. And that wasn't all. Every day, someone had to repair something. A cracked roof beam, a broken pot, a worn-out tool. You'd patch it with pitch, bind it with sinew, sand it down, and hammer it again. Nothing could be wasted. Not wood, not leather, not even cloth scraps. Every item was part of the family's chance at surviving another month. Lunch wasn't a break. It was more of a pause. A handful of dried fish, a chunk of hard barley bread, maybe some oiled greens if anything was left. You didn't sit down. You leaned against the house wall, chewing slowly, eyeing the horizon, always alert. In the afternoons, you helped spin rope, cut reeds for roof thatch, shape bone into needles. The chores didn't end when the sun went down, they just changed. Inside the turf house, under the dim oil lamp, someone would mend cloaks, someone would stitch wounds, someone else would grind grain with a heavy stone mill. Back and forth, hour after hour, until your arms ached and your legs gave out. By night, you collapsed into the hay bedding, eyes stinging from smoke, muscles twitching. You wouldn't fall asleep right away. Your ears stayed open. For wolves, for raiders, for storms. But when you finally did drift off, it wasn't restful. It was a holding pattern in your body, trying to recover just enough to do it all again tomorrow. And you would, because in the north, chores weren't chores. They were the spine of life, the quiet heartbeat that kept the family alive, one breath, one bucket, one bundle at a time. Out here, survival didn't just depend on your own strength. It also depended on who lived just beyond the ridge. Your neighbors. You didn't choose them. You inherited them along with the land, the past grudges, the whispered insults, and the invisible fences no one dared cross. Viking society didn't have police. It had honor, and it had axes. Feuds weren't always loud. Sometimes they simmered quietly beneath the surface. Two men might trade goods in the market with calm voices, while their eyes said something colder, something older. A small insult 5 summers ago, a cousin who stole sheep, a drunken fight that ended in a scar, and that was enough. You didn't just step onto another man's land. You made sure someone was watching when you did it. You raised your hands in greeting. You waited until they invited you to speak. Not out of politeness, out of necessity. One wrong move and you could be accused of trespassing, of disrespect, or worse, of challenging them. A challenge was never just between two men. It involved brothers, cousins, friends. Feuds were contagious. They passed from mouth to mouth like fire in dry grass. You had to be careful about everything. How you looked at someone, how close you built your fences, how loud your animals got during the night. Even your dog barking too much could be seen as a kind of provocation. Say a neighbor accused you of letting your goats graze too far up the hill. He claimed your animals trampled his crops. You knew it wasn't true, but what mattered wasn't the truth. It was the perception of honor. If you backed down too quickly, people would whisper that you were weak, that your family could be pushed around, that maybe your sons weren't as strong as they looked. So you responded. Maybe you offered silver as compensation, a peaceful gesture, a chance to diffuse the tension. But he refused, said your silver was an insult, said you owed him dignity, not coins. Now things were dangerous, because he had publicly rejected your offer. If you didn't respond strongly, he would own the narrative. And once a narrative takes hold in a small Viking settlement, it's hard to shake loose. Maybe the next day, you find one of your fence posts chopped in half. No one saw who did it, but everyone knows. The axe had spoken. Your move. What do? Do you retaliate quietly, at first? Break one of his fishing traps down at the stream? Send a message to his brother that maybe his livestock should be better guarded? Or do you go to the community gathering, and demand arbitration? That's the thing about Viking feuds. They weren't lawless. They had rules, structured chaos. You could request a formal judgment, bring witnesses, present oaths, but the thing was only as fair as the reputations involved. If your family had enemies, the vote could turn against you. If the local chieftain favored your rival, justice might not mean what it was supposed to mean. And so, most times, it didn't get that far. One day, your son comes home with a bruised lip. He says it was from playing. But you know better. The neighbor's boy, same age, same fire in his eyes. You watch the hills carefully that week. You check your axes every morning. You sleep with one near the door. The thing about Viking feuds is that they often passed from generation to generation. A spark from an old argument could set an entire hillside ablaze figuratively or literally. Houses were burned, livestock poisoned, and sometimes someone just didn't come back from a hunting trip. And yet, despite all of this, you still had to cooperate with your enemies. You saw them at the market. You traded with their relatives. You helped raise the roof of their cousin's house, because if the community failed, everyone failed. It was a strange, balance-frozen tension wrapped in ritual cooperation. Viking settlers couldn't afford to live completely alone, but they also couldn't afford to trust too easily. So you lived carefully. You carried your axe even when you weren't chopping wood. You kept one eye on the horizon and the other on the paths between your house and theirs. You taught your children to be kind, but not naive. Because out here, survival wasn't just about crops or cows or winter storms. It was about knowing when to smile and when to reach for the axe. Life in the Viking Age could end quietly and terribly. Not in battle, not with glory, but in a bed of straw, in a room that stank of damp wood, rot, and fear. You didn't need a sword in your ribs to die in this world. All it took was a cough, a fever that wouldn't break, a wound that festered under animal skins and woolen wraps, or a winter too long for your body to endure. You'd seen it before. A child who went to bed shivering and didn't wake up. A neighbor who limped after a fall and was gone before the month turned. A woman strong, kind, who bled too long after childbirth. These things didn't spark stories. They weren't remembered in the sagas. They were quiet departures, forgotten quickly because too many came after them. In your household, there was no such thing as real rest, especially not during sickness. You might have heard the faint wheezing from the far side of the turf house. Your wife's mother, wrapped in furs, eyes fluttering open and closed. She hasn't eaten in days. Her skin is pale, her hands colder than the room should allow. She tries to whisper to you, but the words don't make it. There's no doctor to call, no hospital, no name for the illness beyond what you guess. Bad blood, winter fever, or the curse of the old gods. You try what little you can. Warm water, herbs, the last of the mead. You whisper words you only half believe in. You ask Odin to ease her pain. You ask Freya to take her gently. But you don't know if anyone is listening. All you can do is sit, wait, and try not to think about what happens if it spreads. Viking turf houses were not places of clean air and separation. The same smoke that warmed your family also choked your lungs. The animals stabled inside the home at night brought lice, fleas, and worse. The dampness of the walls crept into the bones of the old and young alike. Children rarely survived past 5, and those who did carried scars, physical or emotional, from the sicknesses they watched consume their kin. If someone died in your home, there was no procession, no grand church service. You and a few others would dig through hard, frozen soil. It could take hours. The ground resisted every stroke of your spade. Your hands would be raw, numb, and as you dug, you'd be thinking, who's next? You'd wrap the body in cloth, or in their best clothes if you could afford the gesture. You'd lay them with a small blade, or beads, or a token of their life, something to guide them to the next world. If they'd been strong in life, maybe you whispered to others that they'd dine in Valhalla. But deep down, most people didn't expect Odin's Hall. They just hoped it wouldn't hurt anymore. Sometimes the village held a small gathering. Ale was passed around. A few words were spoken. Stories were shared. And then it was back to life. Because it had to be. Your animals needed feeding. Your roof leaked. Your neighbor's son was acting strange again. Grief had no luxury to linger. It came like the wind sharp, stinging, and then it moved on. But you remembered. Not always out loud. But at night, as the fire died low and everyone else drifted to sleep, you would glance at the empty corner where the blanket used to be folded. You would reach for a cup that was no longer needed, and you'd feel it, that dull ache, that hole that no gods, no sagas, no feasts could ever quite fill. You didn't speak of it much. Your people believed in strength, not in dwelling on what couldn't be changed. But that didn't make the pain smaller. It just made it quieter, like a cold that settled into the bones and stayed through every season. And when your own time came, you only hoped someone would remember your name, even if it wasn't sung by skalds or written in runes. Because the Viking Age was not kind to memory. Unless you died with blood on your blade and fire in your eyes, you were swept away like ash on the wind. But you hoped, maybe, someone would whisper your name once more by the fire, even if just for a moment. Night falls hard in the north. It is not soft and velvet like in warmer lands. It does not settle gently. It devours. The long dusk stretches for hours until the last red fades, and suddenly the world is black. And in that blackness, something always watches. You sit by the hearth, its light no longer warm, only a flicker dancing over tired faces. The fire pops, and for a second, your heart jumps, because you think it might be something else. Something moving in the dark outside. But no, it's just the wood cracking. Or at least, you tell yourself that. In the Viking world, belief wasn't contained to temples or sermons. It breathed in the fog. It whispered in the woods. The gods weren't distant, they were present. Not just Odin and Thor, but the lesser ones, the quiet ones. Spirits, beings that lived in stones, in trees, in the river, you crossed on your way to fish. You grew up learning their names, but more importantly, you learned their moods. You knew not to whistle after dark. You knew never to throw bones in the stream. And you always left out a piece of bread on the doorstep for the landmeter, the wights that guarded your home. If you didn't, things went wrong. Animals got sick. Fires didn't light. Children had bad dreams that lasted too long. You'd seen it. Your cousin mocked the old beliefs once. He spat on a carved wooden idol outside the longhouse. Laughed about trolls and spirits. That winter, his roof collapsed in the snow. His wife lost her pregnancy. He didn't laugh again. So even if you didn't believe all of it, you acted as if you did, just in case. Inside your turf house, charms hung from the rafters. Bits of bone, dried herbs, and symbols carved in wood. Protection runes, mostly alges for defense, so willow for success. Your mother said these marks kept out the draugr, the dead who walked when they weren't buried right. And even if no one had seen one in years, nobody wanted to be the reason one came back. If you were lucky, there was a vulva nearby, a cirrus. She didn't live like everyone else. Her hut always felt a little colder, a little farther from town, even when it wasn't. People feared her, but needed her. She would paint her face in ashes, wear cloaks woven with feathers, and speak in a voice that wasn't quite her own. She read bones, followed dreams, traced runes into the dirt with trembling fingers. People came to her when they had nowhere else to turn, when sickness lingered, when babies cried too long, when the wind howled in strange tones through the rafters and no one could sleep. You might have gone to her once, when your brother fell from the roof and didn't wake for 3 days. She didn't promise anything, just laid a stone on his chest and whispered a chant in a language that made your ears feel too small. He woke the next morning, pale, sweating, but awake. You didn't question it. You just thanked her, left her a bowl of fish, and told no one, because belief wasn't for bragging, it was for surviving. On cold nights like this one, you hear things. In the distance, branches snapping in a rhythm too steady to be the wind. Whispers, not words, just shapes of voices that disappear the moment you strain to listen. Your dog refuses to go near the back wall of the house. Your daughter says she dreamed of the sea giantess last night, the one that drags boats under when offerings are missed. You nod. You say, it was just a dream. But that night, you throw a silver coin into the bay, just in case. The Norse gods demanded attention, but they didn't promise fairness. Thor might protect your village, or he might not. Odin might grant you wisdom, or madness. Freya could bring fertility, or grief. You didn't pray the way some people do now. You bargained, you hoped, you feared, you acted, and always you listened. For the small sounds that told you whether the spirits were pleased or not. Every thunderstorm had meaning. Every raven that perched on your roof was a message. And sometimes in the dead of winter, when even the fire couldn't quite warm your bones, you would wonder, if you died tonight, would the gods find you worthy? Or would something else find you first? Because in the Viking world, death wasn't the end. But it also wasn't a guarantee of peace. There was Valhalla, yes, the Golden Hall, endless feasts, songs and drink, but only for some. Others went to Helheim, a place of stillness and shadows. Others walked restlessly, unsatisfied, and some never left. That's why your ancestors built burial mounds with stones aligned to the sun. Why they buried the dead with swords and food and gifts, because you never truly left this world. Not all at once. And when the wind howled too loud at night, when strange lights flickered on the edge of the forest, you didn't speak. You just whispered a quiet prayer, rubbed the rune on your necklace, and hoped that tonight you'd be left alone. Your hands are stiff this morning, not from cold, though there's always that, but from labor. Your palms are thick, calloused. Fingers strong, but rough. You don't think of yourself as a warrior. You've never seen a battlefield, but you still wear your scars like armor. Because in your world, survival is the war. You rise and dress slowly, carefully. Every layer matters. The wrong clothing can mean frostbite. Or worse, first comes the linen tunic, soft from years of wear. It's your second skin. Worn close to the body, it holds the heat in. Then wool, always wool. You pull a thick, hand-spun woolen tunic over your head. Its weight is comforting. It smells faintly of smoke from the hearth, of lanolin from the sheep it once belonged to. Wool trousers next, rougher than you'd like, but they've lasted 3 winters and still hold strong. You wind woolen leg wraps called winningis tightly around your calves. Not just for warmth, but for protection, especially when walking through underbrush or snow-crusted paths that hide sharp stones. Your shoes are made from stitched leather, soft-soled, tied with long laces, worn down where your weight presses hardest. You've repaired them more times than you can count, sometimes with rawhide, sometimes with thread made from sinew. Nothing is disposable here. Even clothing is handed down father to son, sister to sister. Every patch tells a story. That tear at your left knee, a fall during the autumn hunt, that scorched hemline, a fire that almost caught the barn last summer. Some days, if you're working outside or traveling to the next village, you wear a wool cloak over everything, clasped at the shoulder with a bone or bronze pin. The cloak isn't just for warmth. It shields you from wind, rain, even judgment. A man without a cloak looks vulnerable, poor, unready. When the weather turns fierce, you might pull on a hooded cowl or wrap your face in fur, so only your eyes peer out, watchful, cautious, always aware. But clothing isn't just about staying alive. It's also about who you are. The richer villagers, traders, jarls, those who've sailed far and brought back silver dress with brighter dyes, indigo from abroad, red from crushed madder root. Some wear imported silk at the edges of their sleeves, just enough to whisper wealth. Their brooches are heavier, their belt knives more ornate. And the warriors? They dress differently still. Chainmail is rare. Very few can afford it. A single shirt of mail takes months to craft, ring by painstaking ring. If you've ever seen one, it glimmers darkly, like river stones underwater. Most fighters wear padded gambesons, thick and quilted, layered over wool. It cushions blows, slows a blade. Not perfect, but better than bearskin. Over it, a round shield strapped to the back when walking, front when ready. Painted with symbols, some for show, some for protection. A circle within a circle. A raven. The rune Taiwas for victory. Helmets are plain, no horns. Just iron bowls, sometimes with a nasal guard. If you're lucky, the helmet fits well. If not, you stuff it with wool for padding, or risk a rattled skull. Your axe hangs at your belt, its blade oiled and sharpened. Not a warrior's axe, but a farmer's, yet it can cut flesh as easily as firewood. You also carry a long knife, the everyday tool. You've used it to gut fish, to carve wood, to skin game. You've also seen it used in defense. Quick, brutal. Even women carry knives, because safety is never a guarantee. There's no police, no army to call. Your strength is in your hands, your neighbors, and the tools at your waist. And everyone knows how to use them. Weapons in your world aren't just tools of violence. They're symbols. A young man receiving his first axe is not so different from a knight being dubbed in foreign lands. It's a mark of readiness, of responsibility, and of danger. There's pride in the way you care for your gear. You rub oil into the blade before bed. Wrap the leather to keep it from cracking. Sharpen it in quiet moments, watching sparks fly off the whetstone like fireflies in twilight. And you dream sometimes of raids, of distant shores, not because you long for blood, but because riches lie there, a better life, more food for winter, a chance to rise above this hard, narrow existence. But for now, your world is here, pulling on layers by firelight, listening to the wind against the walls, tying your belt just so, feeling the weight of your knife settle against your hip. Not because you expect trouble, but because it's always a possibility. In the north, you do not dress for comfort. You dress for battle even, when that battle is just the daily task of staying alive. And when you step out into the gray morning, eyes squinting against the chill, you wear your clothing like a second skin, and your tools like quiet, trusted friends. The smell of smoke is always in your clothes. Not from war, not from burning villages like the stories tell, but from your hearth. From the slow, stubborn fire that keeps the house warm, the one that cooks every meal, the one that never quite dies. Food in your world is not taken for granted. You eat what you grow, what you can store, what the sea or forest will give and not take back. You begin your day early. The sun isn't up yet, but someone's already stirring oats in a pot-thick gray porridge, bubbling quietly over the coals. It isn't sweet. Not unless you're lucky enough to have a little honey, maybe dried berries from last summer, tucked into a cloth sack and rationed with care. Most days, it's just oats, salt, and patience. You sit on the floor, bowl in hand, and eat slowly. The warmth spreads through your chest. It won't fill you completely, but it's something. Enough to carry you to midday. Meals are not a time for chatter. Not really. They're quiet, practical things. A chance to sit, to warm your hands, to think. You listen to the sounds outside, the creak of the wooden walls, the wind brushing snow off the thatch, the occasional low grunt of the animals shifting in their shelter beside you. If you're close to the sea, fish is a staple. You salt it, dry it, smoke it until the fillets go leathery and sharp. Pickled herring sits in stone jars. You chew it slowly. Sometimes you sip ale afterward to wash down the salt. Meat is rare. When it comes, it's cause for quiet celebration. A rabbit snared in the woods. A goose brought down with a sling. Once in a while, a boar, if the men go hunting and the gods are kind. You roast it slowly, never rushed. The fat drips into the fire. The smell spreads like a story across the house. Everyone stops what they're doing. Even the dog knows. You serve it on wooden plates. No spices, save maybe wild garlic or a pinch of mustard seed. The taste is real, deep, not dressed up or hidden, just honest. And then, bones are cracked, marrow sucked out. Nothing is wasted. In summer, your meals are brighter. Berries, mushrooms, wild greens. Flatbread cooked on hot stones. Milk when the cow gives enough. Butter if it's churned in time. Sometimes even cheese pale, crumbly, sharp. But winter ... winter changes everything. Winter shrinks the table. You dip stale bread into broth. Dried peas boiled until they surrender into soup. Turnips sliced thin, fried if you have enough fat to spare. Some days, there's nothing fresh. Just the same dark rye bread, sliced thin. A knob of lard. A cup of weak beer or watered down whey. You eat in silence, your fingers stiff with cold. Still, it's food. You've known leaner times. Your mother once told you how the stores ran out before spring one year. They boiled bark, ate rats, scraped mold from old loaves. You believed her, not because she said it with drama, but because of how quietly she told it. Feasting does happen, but rarely. Maybe after a wedding, or the birth of a child, or if a ship comes back with goods from far away. Then, for a few hours, the house is loud, full. You roast a whole animal on a spit. There's ale, bread, laughter, music. People loosen their belts. Children fall asleep by the fire with sticky hands. And for one night, food feels abundant, but it never lasts. The next morning, you're back to scraping the pot, back to counting what's left, back to saving the bones for soup. You dream of honeyed cakes sometimes, of sweet wine, of roasted apples split open with nuts inside. Things you've maybe tasted once or heard about in stories of far-off lands where the winters are kinder. But you don't ask for those things. You focus on what you have. A warm bowl, a crust of bread, the occasional gift from the sea or sky or soil. And you learn to be grateful, to eat slowly, to savor the warmth more than the flavor, to share what you can and hide what you must. Because in your world, food is not just fuel. It's memory. It's hope. It's proof that you're still here, still waking, still eating, still alive. You don't remember your own first steps, but you remember the steps of others. Your younger brother, stumbling across the dirt floor with arms outstretched. Your cousin's daughter, toddling through the sheep pens while her mother called after her with a voice full of both laughter and fear. Viking children do not grow up slowly. The North does not allow it. You were born into a world of silence and responsibility. And if you cried, no one speaks of it now. The first sound you ever heard was likely not a lullaby, but the rasp of kindling, the hush of wind beneath the turf roof, the low murmur of your mother's voice, soothing but never soft. There were no brightly colored toys waiting for you. No cradle carved for luxury, just hands calloused, steady hands that held you tight in the dark. Childhood here is short, but not joyless. As a child, you played when you could. You learned to walk in a home that was half shadows, half smoke. You followed your mother to the river with a cold water bit at your toes and the reeds whispered secrets in the wind. You learned to listen to people, to animals, to silence. Because listening was the first kind of wisdom. By the time you could hold a spoon, you were given chores. Simple ones first, chasing chickens from the garden, gathering kindling, fetching water if the snow wasn't too deep. Your small hands learned the shape of work before they knew letters. If you were a boy, you practiced throwing stones at tree trunks, not for fun, but to sharpen your aim. You watched the older boys spar with sticks, copying their movements with awkward bravery. You admired their knives, not as toys, but as tools you would someday be trusted to wield. If you were a girl, you learned to spin wool with fingers still chubby from youth. You sat at your mother's side, mimicking her needlework, your stitches uneven but proud. You were shown how to knead dough, how to swaddle a baby, how to mind the fire without burning your hair. Education came from watching, from doing, from being told once. You did not ask why. There was no room for that. Things were done because they had to be, because not doing them meant risk. You did not go to school, not in the way other lands might imagine, but you learned every day. Your alphabet was the shape of the runes carved into the beams above the hearth. Your math was counting sheep, dividing food, weighing choices. Your history came through stories long tales by Firelight, of gods and giants, of kin who had crossed the sea and never come back, of brave women who burned beside their husbands without flinching. And through all this, you grew. You grew knowing pain. Scraped knees, broken fingers, frostbitten cheeks. You didn't cry, not loudly, anyway. Children who cried too long were shushed, not out of cruelty, but out of survival. Sound traveled. Sound invited wolves. Or worse, men. But you also knew laughter. Not the shrill giggles of a playground, but the deep, breathless laughter of hiding under a wagon during hide and seek. Of watching your father stumble while dancing during a feast. Of stories so ridiculous they made your belly ache from holding it in. There were games, too. Wooden tops spun on the floor. Stones arranged in puzzling patterns. Wrestling in the mud until someone tapped out or lost a tooth. and love always love. It wasn't spoken often, but you felt it. In the way your mother tucked fur beneath your chin on cold nights. In the way your father nodded when you carried the firewood without dropping it. In the way your older siblings stood in front of you when danger came near. The biggest fear in a Viking childhood wasn't monsters. It was winter. It was hunger. It was being too small to help, too weak to carry your share. So you learned to be strong. You stood taller. You carried more. You said less. By the time you were 10, you could do nearly everything an adult could. Herd sheep, salt fish, stitch wounds, tell stories. And soon, too soon, you would be asked to choose your path. For boys, to stay and farm, or to sail and fight. For girls, to marry, to bear children, to manage a household. Some resisted. Some dreamed of more. A few chased those dreams. Most stayed. Not because they lacked courage, but because they understood the weight of duty. Childhood in the North was not innocent, but it was meaningful. You belonged to a world that needed you, that shaped you quickly, sometimes harshly, but never without purpose. And now, when you see the next child lifted from the bed of furs and soot, eyes still foggy from sleep, you see in them not just softness, but strength waiting to bloom. Because here, even the smallest hands learn to carry the fire forward. The fire is burned low again. The embers are quiet now, casting long, flickering shadows across the turf walls. In the Viking North, it is in these shadows that your mind begins to wander. Not to the things you can see, but the things you cannot. You do not need a priest to teach you fear. You do not need scripture to explain what waits beyond the trees. In your world, fear is a daily companion, subtle, patient, and always watching. There are places you do not go after sunset, not because they are far, or even dangerous, but because of the stories. Every household has them. The stones that sing in the night, the hollow in the woods where footsteps echo twice, the mound behind the pasture where the wind never blows quite right. You were warned of these places when you were young, not with terror, but with the kind of quiet certainty only the old possess. Don't whistle after dark, your grandfather said, or you'll call something that whistles back. He didn't smile when he said it. He didn't have to. The unseen world was always around you, in the rustle of the trees, in the crackling of firewood when it split suddenly, like something hiding inside wanted out. Even the animals seemed to know. The goats would sometimes refuse to cross a certain patch of grass. The dogs would bark at corners where nothing moved. Some nights, when you were too tired to fear anything, you would fall asleep to the sound of wind across the roof. But other nights, you would lie awake. Not cold, not uncomfortable, just listening and wondering. The Norse spoke of many things: gods, giants, heroes. But what they spoke of most, quietly and without ceremony, were spirits. The Huldafolk, the hidden people who lived in rocks and hills and sometimes right beneath your floor. They were not evil, but they were not to be trifled with. You left offerings outside for them, bits of bread, a spoonful of broth, a carved token. Not because you were superstitious, but because you respected them. Because you had seen what happened when people didn't. One winter, a man from the neighboring village dug a new well without asking the land spirits first. He laughed at the old woman who warned him. Within weeks, his cattle grew sick. His tools rusted overnight. His youngest child stopped speaking. No one could explain it, but everyone understood it. Fear in the Viking North wasn't screaming or running. It was silence. A tension in the chest. A slow, creeping sense that something was watching from just outside the circle of firelight. And yet, there was beauty in it too. You learned to walk softly, to speak gently, to treat the world as if it were alive, because in many ways, it was. The forest was not just trees, it was memory. The sea was not just water, it was will. The sky could shift in a moment, not just with weather, but with meaning. You marked the seasons not only by the stars, but by what the dreams began to say. There were dreams that foretold trouble, dreams that came with smells, blood, salt, smoke. And there were dreams so vivid they didn't feel like dreams at all. Some claimed they'd been visited by ancestors, others by things that had no names, no faces, only presence. You might laugh at it now, sitting safe behind your hearth, with the doors barred and the goats sleeping peacefully in the pen. But deep down, you know you wouldn't laugh if you had to walk out into the forest now. Not alone. Not in this light. Even the bravest warriors in the village had stories they wouldn't tell while the moon was high. Men who had sailed to distant shores, battled kings, returned with gold, and who trembled at the sound of a baby crying in an empty house. You remember when old Joran passed. He was buried with his axe and his shield, a coin beneath his tongue. And yet, for weeks afterward, no one used the path by his grave after sunset. It wasn't disrespect. It was recognition. Death didn't always take everything with it. And when the aurora would appear, those dancing, silent curtains of light across the northern sky, you would stare with a feeling that was not quite awe, not quite fear. The old ones said they were the shields of the Valkyries, riding into battle unseen. You believed them. How could you not? Fear in the Viking world wasn't only of death. It was of what lingered, of what judged, of what remembered. But it wasn't paralyzing. In fact, it gave you structure, rules, a way to live in harmony with what you didn't understand. You didn't build your house too close to the old mound. You didn't speak the names of certain things at night. You didn't whistle in the woods. You didn't mock the wind. You didn't ignore the warnings of birds. And when someone heard knocking on the door after everyone had gone to sleep, you didn't open it. You waited. You listened. And if nothing else happened, you whispered a prayer. To Odin, to Freya, to the land spirits, to whatever might be listening. Because in the longest shadows of the north, sometimes, something always is. The sea was never silent. Even on the calmest days, when the wind rested and the sky opened in peace, the Norse ocean murmured. It whispered against the hull. It sang beneath the oars. And always, it reminded you do not belong here. You are a land creature, born on soil, shaped by fields and forests. Yet when the time came, you were expected to step into a longship, take hold of an oar, and trust your life to the deep. The ship creaked like an old man waking from sleep. It was not a grand thing, no golden dragon, no banner trailing behind. Just wood, pitch, and rope, carved and patched over the years. But it was your only path forward, or back. You did not sail for glory. You sailed because your chief demanded it, because your harvest was poor, because the farm could not feed another mouth, or because you had made an oath. And in the Viking world, oaths held power. You took an oar, not knowing if you would ever see your village again. You left behind the scent of smoke on turf, the warmth of your family's breath in the cold mornings. And now, the ocean spread before you like a silver sheet, reflecting a sky that didn't care whether you lived or drowned. The rhythm of rowing became your heartbeat. In, out, pull, release. Your hands blistered. Your back ached. Salt crept into every crack of your skin. You could go days without seeing land, weeks without seeing a single bird. The navigator, an older man with one cloudy eye and fingers that never stopped twitching, read the sun, the stars, the wind. He tasted the salt in the air. He watched the birds, their flight paths, the color of the siphon. His mutterings became your compass. You learned quickly that bravery was not what movies would one day show. Bravery was not leaping from ship to ship with an axe raised. It was getting through the second night of rowing with your joints locking and your fingers numb. It was staying awake while others slept, so the sea didn't swallow you unnoticed, and it was watching the horizon for the wrong kind of clouds. Storms in the north came suddenly. The sky turned from gray to black like a curtain being drawn. The waves became walls. The ship, a cradle of sticks, lifted and dropped, slammed and tossed. You bailed water with a carved bowl, prayed to Thor, and cursed your oaths. One man went overboard once. You heard the splash, but saw nothing. No shout, no struggle, just the emptiness after. You searched the waters for a while. Then someone muttered, "He's gone to Gyr now," and everyone went silent. You did not speak his name again. Every splash of salt on your face reminded you, the sea does not make promises. The sea does not mourn. Food spoiled fast at sea. The bread turned hard. The fish turned soft. You chewed on dried meat, rationed water, and hoped the winds would favor you. You dreamed of the taste of warm broth, the weight of sleep beneath a roof, the smell of wet wool drying by a fire. Sometimes someone would sing, quietly, not to lift spirits, but to keep fear at bay. An old ballad, barely more than a hum, about a man whose wife waited for him beneath the northern lights. She waited too long. The story went and turned to snow. Everyone knew songs like that, and no one asked why we sang them. There were days when the sea was glass, the sky pale, the sun distant and cold. It felt like time stopped. You couldn't tell east from west. You rowed anyway. You trusted that the man with the twitching fingers still knew where the world was. You thought of your family. Did they look at the sea each day, wondering if you still lived? Did the children still sleep near the hearth, or had the wolves grown bold in your absence? Then came the gulls. That first cry, sharp and ugly, was the sweetest sound you'd ever heard. It meant land. It meant hope. And when the shore finally appeared, low and dark like a sleeping beast, your heart lifted and dropped again. Because reaching land didn't mean safety. It meant a different kind of uncertainty. Would the people greet you? Or fight you? Would there be trade? Or blood? But you stepped ashore. You kept your oath. Some men never returned. Not because they died, but because the sea had changed them. Something in their eyes didn't come back. They sat by the fire at night, but never leaned close. They stared at water for too long. They flinched at thunder. Even those who returned physically whole had seen too much. The vastness of the sea, the smallness of their place in the world. You understood why the Norse gods were so tied to the ocean. Njord, god of the sea and wealth, was worshipped not for generosity, but for mercy. Gyr, the sea giant who brewed storms and sank ships, wasn't hated. He was respected, feared. And when you sailed again, and you would, whether for war, for trade, or for exile, you placed a carved figure at the prow. A guardian, a talisman. Maybe it helped. Maybe it didn't. But you felt less alone when the wind howled. To be a Viking was not to conquer. Not always. Sometimes it was simply to endure. You held your oar. You whispered your oath. And you rode into the fog, not knowing if your name would ever be spoken again. Justice in the Viking world did not come in the form of jails or black robes or echoing courtrooms. It came in the shape of a man standing on a mound, speaking old words to a silent crowd. It came in the trembling hush of a gathering at the Thing, the great meeting place where laws were spoken aloud and wrongs were weighed not by the gods, but by the people who lived among you. The law speaker was not a king, nor a priest, nor even someone always trusted, but he was remembered. He held in his mind hundreds of laws, passed down through generations. He did not read from scrolls or stone. He remembered them. Every clause, every exception, every punishment. Imagine the pressure of that role. You wake before dawn, with frost still clinging to the turf, knowing today the people will come. They will expect justice. They will expect words that do not shake. You sip water, say little, and feel the weight of 100 minds gathering around your silence. The thing was not just a place to argue or to punish. It was where every free man was expected to speak, to vote, to listen. And though voices might rise and emotions spill, there was an order and invisible scaffolding of tradition. The circle must be respected. If you were the accused, you stood with your kin behind you. Their presence mattered. If they refused to stand with you, it said more than any judgment. Maybe you had stolen a sheep. Maybe there was blood on your axe and questions about why. Or maybe it was a matter of land, where your wall ended and another man's began. In Viking society, disputes were rarely black and white. They were tangled with pride, family, reputation, and need. The law speaker began to recite. His voice was not loud, but firm. He would begin with the law that applied, and then, slowly, he'd guide the gathering through the proper procedures. Who had rights? Who had responsibilities? What fines were due? What line, if any, had been crossed? For serious crimes, such as murder or arson, the punishment could be grim. Not death, at least not always, but something worse in Viking eyes: exile. To be exiled was to be erased. You would no longer be protected by law. If you were harmed or killed, no one could seek revenge on your behalf. You became outlawed, not hunted like in stories, but simply ignored, vulnerable, alone. There were degrees of outlawry. Lesser outlawry might last 3 years. Full outlawry meant forever. No return, no welcome, no name spoken again. For some, that fate was worse than death. But not all punishments were so final. Many crimes required wurgld a man price. If you killed someone, you could pay restitution to their family. The amount depended on the victim's status. A chieftain's death would cost dearly. A thrall's much less. It sounds cold now placing a value on a human life, but it was a system designed to prevent blood feuds. Without it, one death became 2, then 4, then generations of revenge. Wurgld offered a way out, a path back to peace. Yet even if money changed hands, the shame lingered. Public shame was a quiet sort of punishment. No lashes, no prison, just the shifting of eyes when you walked by. The murmurs, the long silences in rooms that used to welcome you. Your reputation, your honor, was currency in the Viking world. Once it was damaged, no gold could fix it. And it was not just men who faced the law. Women, too, could bring charges. They could own land, divorce, and demand justice when wronged. At the Thing, their voices might not thunder, but they could echo. A wife wronged by her husband could return to her kin and claim her dowry back. A woman whose honor was questioned might stand before the law speaker with more dignity than the man who accused her. Even children learned the rhythms of justice early on. They watched their fathers gather at the Thing. They learned who spoke well, who swayed the crowd, and who stood silent out of guilt or fear. The lesson was clear. In this society, words mattered. Memory mattered. As the day wore on, the law speaker's voice grew hoarse. The sun arced across the sky. Smoke curled up from distant tents, where small meals were shared between sessions. Deals were made in quiet corners, alliances too. And when the last verdict was spoken, a hush would fall again. Not of fear, but of relief. The day's work was done. The law had been heard. The community could return to their homes, not always happy, but at least with clarity. The law speaker would sit alone for a while. He carried the weight of secrets, of truths that could not be proven, of judgments that might echo long after his voice had faded. He was not powerful in the way we imagine now. He had no army, no riches, but in the land of oaths and memory, his role was sacred. And so he would watch the people depart, one by one, their lives subtly altered, some lighter, some heavier, but all bound together, still, by the invisible threads of shared law. Justice in this cold and rugged land was not swift. It was slow, spoken, remembered, and in that remembering, it endured. The light fades slowly in the north. Even as the sun slips below the horizon, it leaves behind a pale blue afterglow, soft, haunting, and slow to vanish. Shadows stretch across the valley, touching the hills, the sea, the rooftops of sod houses, huddled together like sleeping animals. The world quiets, not all at once, but gradually, like the long exhale of a day well endured. Inside the turf house, the hearth becomes the heart. The fire crackles with low red embers, casting a gentle glow on wood beams blackened with soot. The warmth draws the family close, mothers sewing, fathers sharpening tools, children laying beside sheepskins, eyes heavy. It is here, by the fire, that stories are told. And it is here, in the deep dark hours, that memory and imagination entwine. You would think the Vikings, bold and weathered, feared nothing. But at night, the bravest warriors still glanced at shadows. They still placed protective charms by the door, or whispered old words for safety. Because when the sun disappeared behind the fjords and the sea turned black, something stirred beneath the ordinary. They called them drog-walking dead, revenants, spirits that refused to stay buried. Not ghosts in the way we know them, but something more physical. You could hear their footsteps on the roof. You could smell the cold on them before they appeared. In the old sagas, the Draugr guarded treasures, attacked livestock, or tormented families out of rage or unfinished business. Even burial mounds were feared, not for what they symbolized, but for what might crawl out. There were stories of witches too, of women who knew the old magic, the seer. Some claimed they could see the future, curse a man with sickness, or speak with spirits. Their presence was both feared and needed, especially when illness came or the livestock failed. By the hearth, these tales took form not with theatrics, but in the hushed tones of someone who half believed what they were saying. Children listened wide-eyed, the flickering fire making their shadows dance along the curved walls. Someone might mention the hag, an Old Norse word for spirit or thought soul. The hag could leave your body in dreams. It could wander, and if you weren't careful, it might not find its way back before dawn. The animals knew too. Horses refused to enter certain places. Dogs barked at empty corners. Even the sheep grew restless when the wind blew a certain way. In a world where life and death walked side by side, where frost could kill as quickly as a blade, belief filled the gaps left by understanding. But it wasn't only fear that colored the night. The hearth was a sacred space. Warmth meant life. And so, night became a time for closeness. Fathers might tell stories of when they were boys, gathering seabirds from cliffs or seeing whales breach off the coast. Grandmothers recalled famines survived, ships built, and the face of a sister lost to sickness. Laughter wasn't forbidden. In fact, it was cherished a balm against the creeping cold beyond the door. Still, the fear lingered, soft as mist. Outside, the wind moaned through the gaps in the wood. The ocean, never far, murmured against the rocks like some old god still muttering in its sleep. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf cried long, mournful, a sound that could shiver straight through your bones. There were protections, of course. Iron was said to keep away spirits. So were runes carved into beams or worn on belts. Some tied knots in red thread for luck. Others recited charms, handed down through generations, half prayer, half poetry. Faith, in these parts, was a mosaic of the Old Norse gods and the creeping influence of Christianity, each belief offering comfort where the other left questions. Eventually, conversation slowed, the fire dimmed. A yawn passed from one family member to the next, like a silent signal. Bedding was arranged, pelts, wool, whatever could trap the heat. Bodies pressed together for warmth. The youngest were tucked in tight. A few final embers crackled and whispered. Outside, all was dark now. No candles lit the paths. No torches burned along the roads. If you had reason to go out to the animals, to relieve yourself, you moved quickly, eyes cast downward, pretending not to hear whatever sound followed your footsteps. Sleep came slowly in such a world. It wasn't always peaceful. Some dreamt of distant battles or lost kin, others of beasts with many eyes, or voices that called from beneath the sea. But there was rest, the kind that came from exhaustion, from knowing you'd lived another day in a land that gave nothing for free. And when the dreams were kind, they were vivid. A long-lost friend, a summer day with no chores, the green of Iceland's meadows in full bloom, a mother's voice, now gone, singing a lullaby from another time. The hearth, though low, still glowed, and in its quiet warmth, the family slept not fearless, but together. Not entirely safe, but not alone. In the Viking night, that was enough. When a Viking died, the world did not simply move on. In these northern lands, where the cold could preserve a body longer than memory, death carried weight ritual, fear, hope, and story. It was not just the end of breath. It was a turning of the earth, a moment that rippled through the village like frost, creeping across still water. There were many ways to die in Viking life. Sickness took children with barely a whisper. Accidents, falls from cliffs, injuries in the forge, bites from wild animals were common and sudden. Others vanished at sea, swallowed whole by waves no one could tame. And then, of course, there was battle. Some fought for land, others for honor, a few simply to feed their family. But no matter how death arrived, the question was always the same. What now? A person's life echoed into the way they were buried. For the poor, a simple grave often dug into a hillside or near a sacred grove. The body might be laid in the fetal position, like returning to the womb of the earth. A few personal items, perhaps a comb, a knife, or a wooden spoon were placed nearby. A blanket of stone, then soil, then silence. But for those of higher status chieftains, wealthy farmers, warriors' burial became a ceremony of identity. Some were interred in ships, or at least in graves shaped like ships, their bows and sterns marked by stones. The ship, in Norse belief, was a vessel not just across oceans, but between worlds. In the cold ground, the dead were given weapons, tools, food, and in some cases, even sacrificed animals or slave servants in the afterlife, they believed. The living mourned not loudly, but deeply. For days, fires burned. Bread was baked in silence. People spoke the name of the dead as if they still sat beside them. Children asked where the soul had gone. Elders answered in poetry and half-remembered verses. Some believed in Valhalla, the great hall of the slain. There, the bravest warriors would fight by day and feast by night, reborn each morning for eternity. But that was not the only path. Women, especially those not of warrior blood, were said to join Freya in her hall of afterlife, called Folkvanger. And many believed in hell, not hell, as later redefined, but a vast, cold realm ruled by a distant goddess of the same name. Not a place of punishment, but of waiting. There were quiet comforts in those stories. A father lost in a raid might now drink mead among gods. A grandmother who died in her sleep could be watching, protecting the household from beyond the veil. The line between living and dead was not as sharp as we imagine. The ancestors remained part of daily life, honored in toasts, remembered in rituals, named in newborns. Sometimes, people even claimed to see them. A shadow in the mist, a whisper in the barn, a sudden gust of wind that extinguished the fire when no one moved. To dismiss these signs was to reject the memory of the departed, and so the dead lingered not feared, but respected. The ashes of the burned were scattered or buried in urns. The bones of the buried slowly turned to dust, but the stories they remained. Even now, when archaeologists uncover a Viking grave, They find traces of a person once fiercely loved. A woman buried with beads and keys, perhaps a symbol of her role as keeper of the household. A man with a sword, rusted but still resting beside him. A child with a carved toy, never played with again. They are echoes frozen in the soil. And what's most humbling is this. Even with our science, our carbon dating, our theories, we still don't know exactly what they believed about death. Not in full, because their world wasn't built entirely on facts. It was built on feelings, fears, and traditions passed down by Firelight. And those things are harder to dig up than any artifact. But we know enough. We know they cared for the dead with tenderness. That grief lived in their bones just as deeply as ours. That they sang the names of those they lost into the wind, hoping it would carry across the sea to wherever their souls had gone. And we know that they wanted to be remembered. For what they built, for how they lived, for the family they fed, the battles they won or survived, the farms they tended, the songs they sang in quiet moments when no one was listening but the stars. Tonight, in your own quiet space, as you lie back and let sleep approach, remember this. You are not so different from them. You hope your life has meaning. You wonder where we go when it's over. You hold on to the small objects that carry memory. A ring, a note, a voice recording. You cherish your name. And you hope, when your time comes, someone will say it out loud one more time, softly, by a fire. And that, perhaps, will be enough. It is not the kind of morning where the sun dances eagerly on the land. The sky is a dull gray, as if the heavens themselves are reluctant to look down on the day ahead. You stand on uneven, wet soil, where your boots squelch with every step. Before you lies a bare skeleton of timber beams. Not yet a home, not yet even a shelter, just the beginning of your obligation to your kin, your wife, your gods. You are building a Viking house. And it's not a craft, it's a punishment in slow motion. A Viking longhouse isn't made in a week, and it certainly isn't made with ease. Every piece of it, every post, every plank, every handful of thatch is a reflection of back-breaking effort. The trees you fell for this project were cut with your own hands, one stroke at a time, using an axe you had to sharpen yourself the night before. You and the other men in your settlement spent weeks dragging them from the forest, rolling them on logs, shoulders aching, mouths dry. There are no carts strong enough to carry this weight, and no roads smooth enough for wheels. There are no blueprints, only memory and guesswork. The older men in the village mutter and squint at the frame, nodding or frowning at angles. A house too narrow will suffocate in winter. A house too wide will collapse under snow. You listen and try to learn, but the cold wind is stinging your eyes and your hands are numb. You press on. The foundation is nothing more than dug-out soil, packed with stones. The earth is unforgiving, dense with roots, and clings to your shovel like it doesn't want to be moved. The process takes days, maybe weeks, as you balance the desire to work quickly with the risk of haste. A misaligned post means a crooked roof. A crooked roof means a leak. A leak means rot, mold, illness, and the possibility of your newborn not surviving the first frost. The turf walls come next, heavy blocks of grassy earth cut by hand. They're thick, damp, and heavy. You slice the blocks from the earth like cutting cake, but each slice weighs more than a child. You heave them over your shoulder, stacking them tightly around the wooden frame. The grass is meant to act like insulation, to hold warmth inside during winter. But for now, it's just mud in your boots and filth under your fingernails. It doesn't matter that your back hurts, or that your fingers are split from splinters, or that your knees tremble when you squat. You build because it is the only thing you can do. The gods won't build your house for you, and neither will your neighbors. They have their own to worry about. The roof is the cruelest part of all. You climb the beams, balancing on wet wood in the wind, hauling bundles of straw or reeds to the top. You lash them down with twine made from animal sinew or twisted wool. If you fall, there's no doctor. If you drop a bundle, you tie it again. If you cry, no one will listen. By the time you finish the shell of your home, your muscles have hardened. You're leaner, rougher. The house looks simple from the outside, like a low, lumpy hill with smoke curling out. But inside is sweat, exhaustion, and silent personal victories. It is not beautiful, but it is shelter. And yet, the work never ends. Rain sneaks in from the corners. The walls sag by winter, and pests find their way through the smallest gaps. You'll patch and patch again. Some nights, the smoke from the hearth won't rise, and you'll cough and wheeze in your own home, eyes stinging. Other nights, the wind howls through the turf, shaking the beams, whispering warnings from the gods or ghosts of your ancestors. You lie awake and wonder if you measured correctly, if the pitch of the roof is too shallow, if the frost tomorrow will crack the frame. You built it with love. But love, in the Viking age, does not keep the cold out. So you build again and again, until the house becomes a part of you, stitched into your routine, into your nightmares and your hopes. Not because you wanted to, but because no one else would do it for you. And because, in this age, a home is not a comfort. It is a battlefield you must win just to survive the night. The day begins not with farming, nor hunting, nor building, but with whispers. Cold air hangs thick outside your turf-roofed home, and yet it's not the frost that chills you this morning. It is the way your neighbor didn't look you in the eye as he passed by. The way the smith's apprentice stopped hammering when you walked near. Something is wrong, and you can feel it in your bones. Word spreads fast in small Viking settlements. Whether you live on the coast or deep in the woods, the community is your world. And when that community turns against you, the isolation is suffocating. Someone, somewhere, has accused you of theft. They say you stole grain from the communal store. Or maybe it was a sheep. No one will say it to your face, but they've said it to the law speaker. In Viking culture, there are no police. There is no investigation, no lawyers, no presumption of innocence. Justice, if it can be called that, is a patchwork of tradition, fear, and superstition. And when no one can prove guilt, or when emotions rise too high, the community turns to something ancient, the trial by ordeal. You are summoned to the thing, the public gathering. A circle of people forms. Faces you've known your entire life are suddenly foreign, cold. Some are waiting to see justice. Others just want entertainment. You in the middle are not a man anymore. You are a question waiting for an answer. The law speaker offers you a choice, though it's no choice at all. Confess and be shamed, punished, fined, or undergo an ordeal, and let the gods decide your fate. You say nothing, but your pride won't let you bow. You agree to the ordeal. There are many types, each more dreadful than the last. Perhaps it will be the hot iron. They heat a rod until it glows, until it is no longer red, but white. You must carry it in your bare hand for 9 steps. The crowd watches as you lift it. Your skin sizzles before you've even gripped it. You bite down your screen. Afterward, the wound is bound in linen and inspected 3 days later. If it festers, you are guilty. If it's clean, you are spared. But everyone knows wounds almost always fester. Or perhaps your ordeal is the boiling cauldron. You plunge your hand into scalding water to retrieve a stone from the bottom. The pain is instant and blinding. You pull your arm out, steam rising from your blistering skin. Again, it will be bound and inspected later, as the rot is more divine than fairness. In some places, there is the ordeal of water. You are tied with rope and dropped into a river or fjord. If you float, you are guilty. If you sink, you are innocent, but may drown anyway. The logic is that pure water, sacred water, will reject the guilty. But it rarely considers that human lungs reject water too. And all of this every painful second is public. The community doesn't look away. In fact, they lean in. Your humiliation is their assurance that justice still exists, that fate still plays a role in their harsh world. And there are some who don't survive their ordeal. Some who do survive, but lose fingers, or the use of a hand, or a lifetime of dignity. Even if you are found innocent, your reputation is never quite restored. The accusation alone was a stain. The ordeal, a scar that never quite fades on skin and soul. People will remember. You'll see it in the way they glance at you, in the way they pause when you pass by. Not out of fear, but uncertainty. You begin to realize the truth. The ordeal wasn't about proof. It was about performance. It was about suffering in public until the gods or your neighbors decided it was enough. And in a society where survival depends on trust, even surviving the ordeal does not always save you. You may be free, but you are not the same. That night, as you lie in your house, if you are lucky enough to still call it yours, you stare at the wooden beams overhead. The fire crackles softly. But sleep does not come easy. You shift, your bandaged hand throbbing. And you wonder, was the pain proof of innocence? Or just a warning from the gods to keep your head down? In the Viking world, justice is not blind. It watches, and it remembers. His name is not carved into stone. You won't find him in sagas or in heroic poems. There were no longships bearing his name, no fierce tales of conquest sung around Firelight. He was not a jarl, not a warrior, not a seer. He was a bondi, just a free farmer among thousands. And like most, he was quietly forgotten. But his life, his routine, his hopes, his slow erosion tells a story that is just as valuable, perhaps more so, because it speaks not of glory, but of the heavy, invisible weight carried by those who kept the Viking world spinning while others chased fame and steel. The bondi was the backbone of Norse society. Not enslaved, but not privileged either. He had rights. He had his own land, usually passed down from his father and his father's father. But what he didn't have was time, or rest, or much of a future beyond survival. Our forgotten bondi's day started before the sun's light touched the frosted grass. He emerged from his turf house, stiff from cold and the cramped, smoky air inside. His children still slept beside the embers. His wife, already grinding barley, didn't speak. The work had to begin before the frost melted. His tools were simple wooden plows pulled by tired oxen, stone weights on fishing lines, old axes that dulled faster than he could sharpen them. The fields weren't rich. They gave enough to last the winter, most years. Other years. He'd watch his neighbor's family disappear one by one until the house sat silent, door swinging in the wind. And yet, each season brought new obligations. The Jarl expected grain taxes. The gods required sacrifices animals if you had them, otherwise offerings of milk, bread, or carved wooden figurines. And there was the thing, the assembly he was required to attend. If he didn't show up, he could be fined. If he spoke poorly, he could be challenged to a duel. He didn't dream of long voyages. He didn't have the money for a ship share, and he couldn't leave the land untended. His dreams, if he had them, were smaller. He wanted his children to live past their 5th year. He wanted the roof to hold through the next storm. He wanted the Jarl's men to pass by his home without knocking, but his status as a bondi was precarious. He was free, yes, but one bad harvest, one lost animal, one foolish penny of these could send him into debt. And in Viking society, debt didn't mean inconvenience. It meant loss of land, of freedom. He could be forced into service. He could be taken as a thrall, a slave in all but name. And so he walked a narrow path. Every day he toiled in silence, measuring his success not in coin, but in how much food he could dry before winter. He built his world around caution, around routine, around endurance. But one year, a storm came early. The livestock shelter collapsed, crushing his best ox. The Jarl's men arrived weeks later, demanding the same tax as always. He couldn't pay. And suddenly, the title of Bondi no longer applied. No one came to his defense. Neighbors, too poor to intervene, turned their eyes away. The law speaker pronounced him liable. His land was taken. His home passed to another man's son. And the Bondi, who had done everything right, who had bent but never broken, vanished. He was not killed. No blood was spilled. And that, perhaps, is the quiet tragedy. There was no moment to mark his end. He faded out, like smoke in the wind. Some say he drifted north and found work as a hired hand. Others say he starved that winter in the hills. No one really knows, and no one truly remembered. Because history often forgets those who do not shout, who do not raid, who do not rule. But still, when you walk through the ancient ruins of old Viking farms, you can feel his presence. In the worn threshold stone, where feet stepped in and out 1,000 times. In the hearth, blackened from years of quiet cooking. In the broken fence line, where livestock once pressed their weight. The Bondi's life was not epic, but it was real. And in many ways, it was the truest reflection of the Viking world-hard, humble, uncertain. He lived not for glory, but for the hope that his children might one day have it easier. And for that, perhaps he deserves to be remembered after all. The wind howled across the dark fields, curling through the cracks of your wooden door. Inside, the fire had burned low, the last of the peat sputtering into embers. Your family lay curled beneath coarse wool blankets, bellies tight and aching with hunger. The last of the barley was gone, and the goat hadn't produced milk in weeks. You listened as your youngest coughed in her sleep, dry and weak. And you tried not to think of the feast happening just beyond the trees, on the rise of land you could see from your farm, the Jarl's Hall, glowing with light and laughter. It wasn't always like this. Or perhaps it always was, and you had simply been too busy surviving to notice. But on nights like these, the contrast felt sharp enough to cut. Up in the hall, the Jarl's hearth roared with well-fed flames. His warriors lounged on furs, thick-bearded and full of mead. Their hands were greasy with roasted lamb, duck, and boar. Carved horns clanked together in bursts of cheer. Silver platters groaned under the weight of meat, cheese, and thick loaves slathered in honeyed butter. You could smell it sometimes, when the wind was cruel-cooked fat and spice drifting down from the high ground. The Jarl's house stood proud and wide, built from the finest timber, roof lined with carved dragon heads. Inside, the floors were dry, the benches warm, and no one there worried where their next meal would come from. You had contributed to that feast, though you weren't invited. Everyone in the district had. Grain tax, livestock tithe, timber levy. It had all gone north, carted by strong men in rough cloaks, eyes averted as they passed your field and saw your children chewing boiled bark to quiet their hunger. And what made it worse, what made it cut deeper, was that the Jarl's men believed themselves generous. Had they not let you keep 2 pigs instead of 1? Had the Jarl not forgiven a late payment last spring when the rains never came? But forgiveness wasn't food. And tonight, your wife stirred and asked if you'd caught anything in the snares. You hadn't. The traps were empty, the woods hunted thin by men with better bows. Meanwhile, at the feast, the skald sang of victories of foreign lands burned, of ships sailing home heavy with silver and stolen silk. The Jarl laughed, gripping the shoulder of a warrior who had once broken a Saxon spine with his bare hands. His sons boasted of raids yet to come, while their servants poured more ale and wiped the bones clean from trenchers. They did not think of you. Not really. You were part of the landscape, like the trees or the stones useful, maybe even respected in word, but ultimately invisible. It wasn't envy exactly. You didn't want the hall, or the fur-lined cloaks. You didn't dream of killing for loot, or sailing beyond the seas. You wanted a winter without starvation, a spring without burying a child, a roof that didn't leak. But your loyalty bought you nothing. You worked their land, paid their tax, followed their laws, and still you shivered while they sang. And yet, when the Jarl called for men in spring, when he needed oars pulled and swords swung, you would answer. Not because you believed in his glory, but because saying no wasn't truly an option. Refusal could bring shame, or exile, or worse, retribution dressed as law. The divide between you and them wasn't just wealth. It was insulation. They had the power to shape stories, to call a poor man lazy, to call your hunger natural, to dismiss your death as a sad but necessary cost of order. And so, your family huddled near the fireless hearth, listening to the wind and the far-off echoes of laughter from the hall. Your stomach twisted again, a slow, dull pain that never quite left anymore. But in the morning, you would rise. You would gather what scraps you could, check the traps again, patch the roof once more, because you had no choice. And the Jarl would feast again soon, and again after that. And perhaps one day, your son would stand at that table, not as a guest, but as a servant, pouring drink, sweeping bones from the floor, smiling on command. He would be closer to the heat, perhaps, but not to freedom. That remained, as always, just out of reach on the other side of the firelight. The snow outside had turned to ice days ago. Not that you noticed the change immediately. Your hands were already cracked and red, your feet always cold no matter the layers. But this morning, the frost had climbed the inside of the walls. Tiny crystals clung to your combs and bowls, glimmering like mockery in the half-light. You rose before the sun again. You always did. Before the fire could be coaxed back to life. Before the bread could be kneaded. Before the baby cried, or the goats had to be milked, or the loom needed threading again. There was no such thing as rest for a Viking woman in winter. Just a slower, quieter labor that no skald would sing about. While the men spoke of raids and frost giants, you scraped the soot off pots with a bone tool, humming to the children to keep them calm. While warriors wrestled outside to keep warm, you were inside breaking ice from the water barrel, then warming it by the hearth just enough to wash the filth from the linen. You didn't wear jewelry. You hadn't in years. It caught on wool and soaked in milk and blood and soot. You didn't complain, though. That wasn't your way. You managed, like your mother did, and hers before her. You carried the stories of your line in the way you salted meat, in the prayer you whispered when the snow came early. You had once hoped to be remembered. Maybe your name carved on the end of a loom, or passed through generations as the one who made the best butter, or kept a family alive during the blight. But you had learned that memory was a fickle luxury in her world, one mostly reserved for men who had bled on foreign soil. You watched your daughter carry a pail half her size, arms straining, face still and brave. She would inherit this rhythm soon. The silent waking, the endless work, the carrying of lives, children, husbands, households on shoulders that were never allowed to sag. You did not get to grow old. Not truly. You wore your years early. In the ridges on your palms, in the missing teeth, in the way you no longer flinched at death, only nodded. Tonight, when the fire burned low and the house grew quiet, you would sew by oil light, a torn tunic, a worn sock, maybe stitch your own finger again, not out of clumsiness, but haste. And you would think of your sisters who had died in childbirth, of your mother lost to fever, of the quiet ones who vanished into the snow with no songs, no stones. But you were still here, still waking, still warming others, still holding the shape of a home around everyone else's exhaustion. And when the wind howled again, you would throw another log on the fire, and keep going. There were no headstones, just the hard, frozen earth and the hollowed-out spot near the birch trees where you'd buried him last winter. No markers, no rune stones, no carved names. Just your memory of where you knelt, where you cried, where the frost cracked beneath your knees as you covered his face with cloth and earth. He was your brother, or your son, or your friend. It doesn't matter now, because time in these lands works differently. The snow erases footprints faster than grief can settle. No one talks much of the ones who stayed behind, the ones who died not in glorious battle, but of infection or hunger, or the simple act of falling into a frozen creek at the wrong time of year. There is no Valhalla for those. No drinking horns in the next world. Just quiet. He was young. He had big hands and a crooked smile. He could carry a full basket of fish without ever spilling one. And when he laughed, even the chickens stopped squawking. You remember that. But you wonder, sometimes, if anyone else does. The living move quickly here. There is no time for long mourning. There's always another child crying, another roof to fix, another tax to pay. Your grief must not interfere with the duties of the day. You visit his grave sometimes, quietly, alone. You bring a carved bone trinket or a braid of his favorite herbs. Once, a strip of leather he had been working on before the fever took him. You place them on the earth. The wind takes them soon after. And still, the land does not remember. In the spring, roots will grow over that patch. A goat might graze there. Children might play. The world keeps turning. Not cruelly, just indifferently. There are no poems about him. No tailies around the hearth. His name has already grown faint on people's tongues. But not yours. You carry it. You whisper it when the night is long. You murmur it into your bread dough, into the wind, into the firelight. And in that whisper, for a moment, he still lives. Even if no one else notices, even if the sagas forget, you remember. And that, perhaps, is the truest act of love the North ever knew. The sun hadn't risen in days. Not truly. Not in any way that warmed the skin or stretched a shadow. It hovered behind the clouds like a promise long broken, a pale smudge that barely tilted above the horizon, then faded again like a shy ghost. You had stopped marking the days. Not because you couldn't, but because you didn't want to. The tally stones near the hearth had run out of space weeks ago. What did it matter? Every morning felt like dusk. Every evening felt like midnight. You lived in a permanent half-light. Not quite night, but never dawn. This was not new. Every winter in the north came like this. Slowly at first, then all at once. The days shrank to nothing. The air grew sharper than knives. And a silence fell so thick you could hear the snowflakes landing on the roof. There was food, but only just dried cod, salted lamb fat, rancid butter in an earthen jar. Every bite was work, every meal a calculation. Who got the last turnip? Who pretended they weren't hungry? Who gave their portion to the child without saying a word? You noticed the way people stopped talking, not just out of cold, but out of fatigue. Conversation became nods. Stories were saved for spring. There was no space for laughter. Not in this kind of cold. Not when every movement ached and your own breath made frost on the inside of your cloak. The children were restless. They played for a time, but even games grew quiet when there was no sun to divide 1 hour from the next. You caught one of them staring at the ceiling, counting beams, eyes wide and tired. You didn't know what to say. You just sat beside him and handed him a carved bone toy you made when you were his age. Sometimes you swore you heard things in the night, not animals, not spirits, just memory, echoes of warmer days, the splash of water in a fjord, the soft thud of moss underfoot, a woman's laugh, maybe your sister's, or a voice from your youth, one long buried by snow and time. You didn't tell anyone. You knew better. You weren't going mad. This was just the cold and the silence and the stretch of darkness that makes you remember things you'd thought were gone. That's what the deep midwinter did. It folded time into itself, turned the present into a slow-motion dream. On the worst nights, you wrapped your furs tight and sat by the dying fire, staring into the embers. You let your mind wander across the ocean. You imagined green fields again. You remembered the sea salt in your hair, the way your mother braided it with care. You thought of people who were no longer here, not taken by battle, but by time and cold and quiet forgetting. They didn't vanish in glory. They just slipped away. And you wondered if you too would vanish like that, without song or saga, just faded into a long winter's hush. And yet, somehow, you were still here, still breathing, still lighting the fire, still rising from your bedding each gray morning to feed the goats, to tend the hearth, to brush snow from the thatch, to whisper a prayer to the low sky and hope it heard you. Hope that the light would return, that the snow would melt, that the days would stretch again, that the geese would fly and the soil would thaw, and that one morning the sky would burn gold again instead of gray. And when that morning came, if it came, you would not cheer, you would not celebrate. You would simply open the door, feel the sun hit your face for the first time in weeks, and close your eyes, and just stand there, alive still, and let the warmth carry you back, slowly, to the world. And now, the fires of the longhouse burn low. The wind has quieted outside the turf walls. The sea is calm, lapping gently against the shore like a sleeping breath. The hammering has stopped. The fields are still. Even the birds that circled above the fjords have tucked their heads beneath their wings. You've journeyed through the raw heart of a Viking's world, not the glory-soaked tales sung by skalds, but the quieter truth, the heavy mornings, the grinding work, the bonds between family, the struggle to survive one more harsh winter, the quiet dignity of those who will never be named in the sagas, but whose lives were every bit as full and fragile. You've felt the bite of cold stone floors and the weight of wooden tools in calloused hands. You've heard the creak of leather boots in snow. You've looked out from a ship's prow, heart pounding with fear and courage alike. You've stood at a grave and let silence answer your questions. And now, you return not to a battlefield or a feast hall, but to your own bed, a place of stillness, a hearth of your own making. Let this final moment be free from time. There's no need to hold on to the images or details. Let them dissolve like mist on a morning fjord. Let your breath slow. Let your body sink. The past is distant now, but it has touched you in ways words cannot measure. The rhythms of ancient life have merged with the quiet rhythm of your breath. And as the final ember fades, you are safe, held in warmth, surrounded by the peace of knowing, even for a short while, what it was to walk in the worn leather boots of another. Let sleep take you now. The sea is still, the stars are watching, and the longhouse, somewhere in memory, is dark and quiet once more. Good night, and thank you for listening.